Okay, awesome. Well, it should be expected. I'm halfway around the world then. Okay, thank you everyone for joining me today. Thank you to the organizing committee, Michelle and Sarah, for this invitation. So my name is Alex Yu, and I'm a senior researcher at Microsoft Research New England. I'm so sad that I couldn't join you all in London this year. I've definitely been seeing a lot of photos coming out from ISMB, and definitely a lot of FOMO for not being with them. But thank you all for attending my talk today. Then. So my talk today is going to tell my personal story of
Alex, you've muted yourself somehow. No. Alex, you have muted yourself.
Okay, test. I'm back. Yes.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Whew. Awesome. Huh.
Who's muting? No, he's not frozen. Alex, there's a reason. There's something is happening because you keep muting. There we go. You're back on.
Yeah. I noticed that I keep on disconnecting and muting me. Hopefully, it will remain stable now. I don't know what's going on. Okay, I'm just going to check ahead, but I'll monitor for that issue then. Okay, great. So my talk today is going to tell my personal story of how I navigated my PhD as a deaf individual, and I'm going to try to connect this to a larger message and how we can move towards inclusion and not merely accommodation, focusing on how we can move from individual to collective responsibility in institutions. Great. Great. Awesome. Okay, so before I give this talk, I think it is important for me to give a positionality statement. I'm going to try to highlight parts of my background to show what kinds of biases I have, and hopefully emphasize that my talk today is just one tiny slice of the whole disability narrative. So one part of me, one fact about me is that prior to and within my PhD, I was a disability justice activist, journalist. So I'm going to shortly talk about how I didn't have enough knowledge about graduate school to know about what kinds of accommodations to ask for. However, I did have knowledge about my legal rights. And in contrast, I've worked with international students who are not aware that Canadian institutions are legally obliged to provide access. So while I start my story from asking for accommodations, many people don't even get to that point then. I was financially stable in my PhD. So you hear me talk a lot about how accommodations required me to do extra labor, and this also typically means increased financial burden. But because I was in a comfortable position, I was actually able to observe that, and so there's less focus about in my story then. I'm deaf, I'm East Asian, I'm cis. So what this means is that I didn't have to deal with gender and to an extent race-based discrimination on top of ableism in our training. But because my particular disability experience didn't have executive function or fatigue attached to it, I was actually able to do the extra labor of accommodations required. So basically, the reason I tell you all of this is that as I give you my presentation, I invite you to think about not just my own story, but also what is missing from it. How would other people from a different disability experience tell a different story? Great. So continuing on about my background a little bit, I was a first generation graduate student. My family is great, but they really had little idea what research was. I remember after my PhD, I had an assistant professor offer, and when I told my mom, she said, "Oh, so you're going to stay in school longer." So I promise you that isn't the reason why I work for Microsoft now, but she certainly does find me a lot easier to explain to her friends. So in that respect, I'm a success story when it comes to underrepresented students getting involved in research. I did my undergraduate in bioinformatics at the University of Western Ontario, where I volunteered for a lab for a summer. That was my first exposure from research. I really loved the experience of setting up computational analyses to help biologists make sensible data. And I took a year off to further pursue that. So by the time I finished my undergraduate, I knew that I wanted to keep on doing this work, but I didn't quite know how. I didn't really understand how academic research really worked at that point. But I did know that graduate school seemed like the next step, so I applied for a master's at the University of Toronto, where I ultimately eventually also did my PhD. So that background is important because of how question accommodations work. Typically, when you enter a new space as a disabled person, you will receive a question, what accommodations do you need? And while this is a fair question, it is important for us to understand how this interacts with knowledge graphs. Graduate training is such a unique environment that even the best informed people entering it probably don't know the ins and outs of what all of the training is going to look like. So in my case, let's reconstruct what my knowledge was back in 2016 when I started my master's. As a first generation graduate student, I didn't really have a good sense of what the process of being trained as a scientist is going to look like. So in undergraduate, courses were really important. I assumed, and perhaps I overestimated, that they would be important in graduate school as well. I also vaguely knew that I'd be working on a project to learn the courses, so I assumed I'd be regularly meeting with an advisor. But obviously, this is an incomplete model of how that training process goes. So, for example, as my research progressed, collaborators became increasingly important. As an undergrad student, I was only given smaller compartmentalized projects that I would do with one advisor, so I didn't realize at the start of my master's how much my time would ultimately involve meeting with collaborators. Similarly, I never attended conferences during undergrad, and the lab that I worked for didn't really do lab meetings. So I wasn't aware that there would be expectations about communicating and promoting my research as I entered a new lab with a different culture. So unfortunately, that incomplete mental model leads to incomplete access, not because of my own fault, but because of the way accommodation systems are set up. You are often expected to practice self-advocacy. So you book a meeting with the university's accessibility services, and then the request services with providers that sometimes provide more or less context, and then you explain what your needs are. So unfortunately, it can be really difficult to ask for accommodations when you enter an environment that is unfamiliar to you. And the consequence is that students may only ask for accommodations that incompletely meet their needs or mismatch with the actual experiences. So in my graduate training, I was lucky enough to get a support network that did spend a lot of time brainstorming with me, so we were able to dodge some of these issues. But in my undergraduate experiences, I only had interpreters for classes, not for research experiences due to this issue. So ultimately, this means that students will encounter scenarios beyond their knowledge, and they're going to have to improvise to address these scenarios as they pop up. So, for example, if I never think to account for conferences in my original planning because I never realized they were critical to scientific training, I may not have interpreters for the first conference to go to. Not only does this create friction in experience, we're going to have pretty bad experience at the first conference. We can't really communicate with anyone though, but it means I have to figure out how to solve the problems with trial and error. For the second conference to go to, now I may know to request ASO interpreters, but I may only request them for the session and forget that those sources are critical for networking afterwards. So in this whole meantime, I'm not getting equal access. Able-bodied and children students can just show up to the conference, and to add to injury, I'm the one who has to work to make sure my experience catches up to the experiences of people. So I want to reassure that the experience of building up on accommodation to trial and error is not the fault of a student. So it's no rule that we should expect students to arrive with a full mental picture of how the training is going to proceed, and then therefore what kinds of accommodations you'll need. This is not a burden that we should be placing on the students. So rather, the honest will rely upon your educational institutions and your mentors who do have knowledge of the training process. The question then is, why is this not happening? One explanation is that the institutions themselves lack institutional knowledge. Although they do have knowledge of the training process, they do not understand how disability interacts with the training requirements. So in my case, I was the first deaf graduate student in my department ever. And if we look across my country of training in Canada, there were only 3 standing deaf STEM professors out of 20,000 during my PhD, and none at my institution, so I did not have much to turn to. So, in other words, the systematic exclusion of disabled people in academic training means that many inadvertently get turned into junior pigs for the program. If the program itself has never seen how the training interacts with the disabled student, they're necessarily going to miss details. And so this means that disabled students must encounter improvise interventions to create accessibility as they encounter obstacles in these programs. So this improvision of accessibility creates a label for disabled students because they're now, in addition to the training, they are responsible for creating accessibility. So for me, during graduate school, this felt like having a full-time job on top of my already full-time degree program. I want to make how much of this mandate is concrete, and I'm going to walk you through a real scenario that actually happened to me in my training and trying to go to a conference. So I want to go to a conference. Since I'm deaf, I'm going to need airshow interpreters at this conference. That means I'm going to need to find the conference policy on accessibility and understand who it is I need to contact to coordinate this. And every single conference I've been to in my PhD, the accessibility policy is usually pretty broad. They say that they're committed to access, but the details show important. Bioinformatics is challenging technical content. You can't just have any interpreter. I need someone who is able to translate science at a PhD level. So usually the conference is hosted in a remote city. I don't know any interpreters in that city. Virtually all the time, when they raise this concern to the conference organizers, the organizers won't know either. They've never worked with a deaf scientist before. So naturally, they're going to ask, can I bring my own interpreters instead? That means I'm going to need to talk to interpreters to figure out if they can devote time to traveling with me. I'm also going to need to figure out who's financing the flights in the hotel, because this is not going to be an item under the conference budget, even if they have an accessibility budget available, which 90% of the time they don't. So that means I'm going to need to talk to access services at my home institution and the conference organizer again and put them in contact to discuss things. Sometimes the discussions have gotten so complicated that my advisor just has simply stepped in and offered to pay to simplify things. We say no other principle, but that's how complicated these discussions can be. In parallel, as we're figuring out the funding situation, the interpreters need to prepare. Just because they can do scientific content in general doesn't mean that they'll put up the cutting-edge research at the conference. So it is a huge conference. The interpreters can't prepare for everything. So I'm going to need to spend days going through the program. Hopefully it's available a few months in advance, and earmark every single talking poster that I plan to go to. Then you need to contact the conference organizers again to get materials, abstracts, papers, videos for the interpreters to prepare with. And on top of content preparation, I need to think about preparing the physical environment. So I need to do the AV to make sure that interpreters can get to the front of the room, and you need to ensure that seats are reserved for me though. So that's a high-level overview of all of the additional work that I need to do to attend the conference that a human person would never ever have to think about. And hopefully you believe me when I say that there was so much more than just what I've outlined on the slide alone. So I want to emphasize that the reason why I have to do all of this extra labor isn't because I'm disabled. It's because the conference environment and culture is not designed to include disabled people. And bridging that gap, fitting into an environment that does not include me, means that I have to do extra labor. So this is not anybody. Environments and cultures are designed by people, and we do have the choice to design them to be inclusive. And so to see this, imagine what my experience would be like if the deaf academics who have been the core organizers of these conferences from the very beginning, instead of being the very first interaction with a deaf person being the junior trainee, myself, 20 years later. So in this world, there would have been no question that interpreters would be needed, because otherwise the organizers of the conference themselves would not be able to interact with the speakers in content. So you'd expect that the conference would have already a lot of experience in answering the questions that the individual asks. You'd expect the conference to have a list of qualified interpreters to tap into, a budget interpreters access to tech and AV. So in other words, in a world where deaf people are central to organizing from the very outset of conference, institutional knowledge has already been built and retained, and accessibility is factored in from the very outset. The consequence is that burden is no longer on the individual. All of the extra labor that I have to do simply just vanishes. I would still need to reach out to a conference to make sure that they have been set up and to customize my experience, but they will be able to reassure me that they already have qualified interpreters booked and they've figured out all of the fine details. So it's no longer labor that I have to do. So to reinforce, Accessibility barriers are not created by individuals, but they're created by institutions that are not equipped to address the needs of diverse populations because they have not built and retained institutional knowledge and the mechanisms for accessibility. So this in turn creates individual burden because now disabled people now have to put into a position of having to compensate for the institution's lack of knowledge. So that brings me to the last part of my talk. How is it we can actually build inclusive institutions? We don't live in a world where disabled people have had equal opportunities to lead our academic institutions. And it's only very recently that has changed. So the very bedrock of a training institution is a culture that has ignored a large part of the population for ages. How do we move on from this legacy of inaccessibility to one of inclusion? So one critical point is to make sure that we have the right mindset. Instead of making sure that we are putting the responsibility of change on the institution, not upon individuals. So towards that, it's important for us to remember that accessibility accommodations are stopgaps. They are not full inclusive solutions. So to see this, let's talk about a concrete example. In many cities across the world, if you wander down the streets, you will often see signs like the left in the windows of shops that ask you to ring a bell or phone a number if you need wheelchair accessibility. These are stops that do not have wheelchair accessible entrances, but if you do contact them, they will have a makeshift solution in hand. Most likely, someone will come out and they'll provide portable wooden leg. So hopefully, you can see that this is not a satisfying or equal solution. People who are not in wheelchairs do not need to ask permission to enter. They do not need to wait. This solution also creates additional labor, both for the person requesting entry and for the shopkeeper who has to come out them. So the actual inclusive solution is to actually modify the built environment to install a permanent ramp instead of requesting that individuals knock on the door in order to get access. Great. Sorry, my slides are screwing up. So unfortunately, these kinds of permanent just and inclusive solutions can often take time and research to build because they involve challenging deeply entrenched decisions. So often where you see the wind bill for access signs occurring are in street districts where the roads are hundreds of years old and involve narrow sidewalks and storefronts that are designed in society where people using wheelchairs were never really allowed to move around independently. So hopefully you can see what is happening with ramps in this example is analogous to what's happening more broadly with the current training institutions. I connect this back to my experiences with accessibility services and conferences. Building institutional knowledge is something that takes time, and to an extent, I can understand why this process is not refined when I was the first step people that these institutions have ever encountered. So in other words, sometimes you do need these kinds of makeshift ad-hoc solutions to mitigate inaccessible environments to ensure that individuals don't fall through in the moment. But we should not confuse these gaps with achieving our temporary goal. As we build temporary portable racks, we need to think about how to build long-term environments. So we don't just have an obligation to make sure that individuals are accommodated, but we also must ensure that we are constantly improving our training environment and culture so that the gap between able-bodied and disabled students shrink, and there is a less and less of a gap to bridge with individual accommodations. So this perspective opens up new ways of thinking about accessibility. So for example, now we have an obligation to ensure that students are arriving in environments that set them up for success, and building this foundation is important. One point is having mentors and peers with disabilities, so students not only have people to seek advice from, but they can see themselves represented in the institution. Another is making sure that everyone in the institution is aligned with the mission of accessibility. We also must make sure that accessibility is reflected at all levels, not just socially, but within the budgetary and policy infrastructure of institutions. Great. So this perspective means that we also understand that accommodation generate labor because they are a temporary stopgap in remedying the flood system, not a full solution in themselves. So now we can put ourselves to work on making sure that this labor is fairly distributed instead of falling on disabled students by default. So one question is accessibility considered a shared responsibility? One of the things I really appreciated in my PhD is that my advisor made sure that this was reflected in lab culture. For lab meetings, instead of me begging each student who was presenting for materials to send to interpreters to prepare, he made sure that it was an expectation that each student knew that they had to do this before, like a part of the presentation, which made things a lot easier on me. Finally, we must consider how to continuously improve our environment. During my PhD, I did a lot of work innovating accessibility, as you saw. But what I really appreciated was that accessibility services at the University of Toronto made sure that some of the strategies they came up with were incorporated back into institutional knowledge. So, for example, some of the novel accessibility accommodations I came up with led to a successful experience that are now being offered to undergraduate students in university. That is great. Then. The other dimension is that accessibility services saw the value of piloting new strategy. I was able to request new ways of being accommodated in my department that had never been tried before. And these ways were not dismissed as being as asking for too much or breaking precedent on what would be fair for students. So ultimately, continuously lowering the demands that academic institutions impose on students helps address the leaky pipeline issue. As I showed you in previous slides, there was not a lot of disabled faculty members out there, and part of the reason why is because the cost and energy of doing a PhD is so much higher for disabled people that there was a lot more attrition. So one goal here is to create a virtuous cycle. To ensure that institutions are inclusive, we need to ensure that the leaders and mentors at the institutions are representative of their students. But to get there, the only way that we can do that is to level the playing field so that more people, more disabled people, can make it to leadership positions. Great. So to conclude, I'm going to try to highlight three main points here. Accessibility barriers are systematic. I've showed how they often emerge in lack of institutional knowledge and foundation building. Accessibility accommodations are often imperfect. Asking individuals to adapt to inaccessible environments rather than fixing their environments themselves creates labor burden. And lasting change often means tolerating through inclusive environments. And so we need to create mechanisms that modify the environment and culture rather than focusing on individuals under a hyper-focus like them. Great, that's all of the content I have for you. I'm perfectly happy to take questions.
Thank you, Alex. There is a loud applause in the room. So I am going to open the floor to questions, and I will, if we don't have a microphone, I will repeat the questions.
Okay.
Alex, I hope that this session here today is one of the first steps in the iteration that we work through as trainers towards being completely accessible and inclusive. Yes, Patricia, please.
Thank you, Alex. Great talk. Good to hear from you. My question is, so you have now a very good experience on this. Do you manage to share this experience also with other colleagues or in the institution where you are? And have you find other ways of communities also where you can share this experience that you have?
Sorry, I want to clarify the question a little bit. Are you asking for a specific experiences that made the communication easier universities I've been to, or
sorry, with colleagues from the university as well. So I understand as you at the University of Toronto, you also have this now this experience. So you have exchanged already information or experience with the institution itself, and then from this institution maybe to others, or you yourself also with other communities outside of the University of Toronto.
Right. Okay, so that's a really good question. So the experience can be very variable. I've outlined a lot of reasons why it can be variable. Like one of it is how much institutional knowledge institutions have built around accessibility, for example. So like some institutions, some departments have never really interacted with people like me before. I often get like whenever I go to like conferences, I'm usually the only person that has an ASO interpretation team then. So there is sometimes that joy moment of like when people like figure out, okay, how is it that I actually interact with that with this individual then. Um I would say that one of the keys here is to have the value that everyone should also be included in science. From my perspective, I've been like a lot of unique um, experiences and perspectives on how I do science, specifically because of my background as a disabled individual. But what that should out to mean um, should not out to mean is that we try to treat individuals, quote unquote, all the same, which means that we implement a disability like neutral or disability agnostic policy then. So, for example, there are some adaptations that we have to make when you are interacting with me, both at the individual and systematic level. Just figuring out how to work with interpreters, possibly like move into a collaborative environment with me, I know about them. But that should be considered as part of a process of like, including diverse individuals, not an additional like burden or additional level of hassle that you have to go through in order to interact with me. Then. I don't know if that completely answers the question, but basically, yeah, there is a lot of variance. Sometimes I've had good experiences, sometimes I've had bad experiences, but attitude is often very cool. So like it's not about like me entering the space and expecting someone to be fully accessible. It's a negotiation. Like we work it out together. We communicate together on how to best bridge those communication barriers together.
Let me follow up with a question, Alex. And you're from when you started at the University of Toronto, and we're asked by the accessibility office what accommodations you need, but then there's this gap for all the conferences and seminars and network meetings. Mm-hmm. And by the time you finished your PhD, did that institutional knowledge at the accessibility office change based on your feedback or experience?
Yes, absolutely. So, for example, one of the things that I did in my PhD was I realized there was so much like time spent with collaborators, and that time was more like spontaneous meetings than meetings that could be anticipated in advance, right? So, for example, if you're trying to book interpreters like reactively, which means that you're trying to book an interpreter for a meeting like 2 weeks in advance, then that doesn't really work then because you need like, for example, like maybe you just want to like bump into your colleague in a hallway and chat with them, as opposed to like having your colleague email you, schedule a meeting, wait 2 weeks, and then bam, you can talk about the science. So one of the accommodations that we built was that, like, instead of trying to book interpreters reactively, we booked them proactively. So I had set times when we tried interpreters, regardless of whether I had meetings or not them, and it was during like those times that my colleagues would come and approach me them. So we elevated the accessibility accommodation. The accessibility accommodation did not exist at the University of Toronto before I came in there. But one of the really lovely things about the University of Toronto is that even though we had developed that like accommodation, they didn't like just like wash your hands and be like, okay, that was an accommodation for Alex, and then we're done with that. Then. So what I learned is that in future years, they started offering accommodation not just towards graduate students, but also to undergraduate students, because we realized it would be able to be easier for undergraduates to, like, for example, access office areas, or just like to pop into like various clubs or just have like spontaneous like meetings with their classmates if they were to offer that accommodation to them. So this is one thing I really appreciate about the University of Toronto. They were continuously thinking about how to like, raise the bar, like how to incorporate some of the innovations that like the students made into the institutional mechanism for accessibility through always like reinventing like the wheel and adding additions like to the wheel, as opposed to keeping it as a static picture that way.
Yeah, that's smart. That's really good. One other question from the audience.
Yeah, so And this may be a little bit of wishful thinking, but in this conference today we're speaking in English, which in a way makes it accessible to a lot of people that don't speak English as a first language. Similarly, I'm aware that there are in your case different languages for sign language, like different countries have different ones. So I think for conferences, do you think it's feasible to have a common language for your community, or what would be a good way to address this?
Yes. So we can actually look at precedent for this. STEM is grossly underrepresented when it comes to STEM individuals. So our ways of dealing with this tend to be more ad hoc. But we can look to fields where they do have a lot of deaf academics and scholars in what they do for international conferences. So for example, fields like linguistics, fields like deaf education, they often have a lot more like deaf scholars and actually a community, like a global community of deaf scholars. So in those fields, the conferences would be hosted in international sign language, and that is kind of what you're getting at here. It's not exactly like American Sign Language for English, but it is like a form of sign language that the attendees at the conference will pick up in order to be able to communicate with deaf scholars that come from a different country and therefore have a different sign language. There is one caveat, and that this is a bit of a chicken and egg problem. So for example, my personal experience, I've never went and learned international sign language because there is no conference out there which I would expect to go to and interact with another deaf academic there. Usually, even if I go to ISMB, a crowd of 10,000 people, I would be the only deaf bioinformatician out there. So basically, what I want to emphasize is I like your wishful thinking because you've seen it implemented successfully in many different fields. But in order for that to become like a necessity, something that we should actually implement, there needs to be a need for it. And to create that need, basically we actually need a community of deaf international scholars actually attending the conference with them.